Hi there. Tonight we're taking a journey back in time, many centuries ago, to understand what life was truly like for women in the Middle Ages. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in a vast, sprawling landscape, perhaps a muddy village track or a bustling, fragrant marketplace. The sounds are different. The distant bleating of sheep, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the murmur of voices speaking a language that would sound utterly foreign to your modern ears. You feel the rough texture of homespun linen. Against your skin, the chill of a stone floor beneath your bare feet, or perhaps the unexpected warmth of a hearth fire flickering in the gloom. This isn't just a quaint historical snapshot. It's your reality for the next few hours. You'll experience the smells, the sounds, the daily grind, and yes, even the occasional glimmer of joy that shaped medieval womanhood. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive a week. The conveniences you take for granted, non-existent. The medical knowledge, primitive. The social norms, utterly bewildering. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Right now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, not to your familiar bedroom, but to a small, smoky hut. The light filtering in is dim, not from electricity, but from a tiny window opening covered with a stretched animal bladder. The air smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and something vaguely animal. This is your home. If you're a peasant woman, and statistically, you probably are, this humble dwelling is where much of your life unfolds. You learn early that your hands are your most valuable tools, constantly busy from dawn until dusk. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that the vast majority of medieval people, male and female, lived in rural areas, directly dependent on agriculture. Your days are dictated by the sun and the seasons. A relentless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and preparing food. Imagine the feel of raw wool between your fingers, scratchy and full of lanolin, as you prepare it for spinning. Or perhaps the heft of a water bucket, heavy and sloshing, as you carry it from the communal well. Even a simple task like lighting a fire isn't a flick of a switch. It involves coaxing a spark from flint, nursing it to flame with tinder, and carefully adding fuel. This isn't just domestic chore, it's a vital skill, passed down from mother to daughter, essential for warmth, cooking, and light. A quirky tidbit you might not expect is that medieval women often had a surprising amount of practical knowledge regarding herbal remedies and midwifery, often exceeding the formal, often ineffective, medical practices of university-trained men. You'd know which herbs could soothe a fever, which could ease the pains of childbirth, or even which plants could act as a mild sedative for a restless child. Historians still argue whether the perceived lack of formal education for women truly meant they were uneducated, or if their education simply took a different, more practical and oral form, vital for survival. You are, in many ways, a living encyclopedia of practical survival. You know how to cure meats, preserve fruits, make cheese, brew ale, and even tend to minor injuries. Your hands are calloused, your back might ache, but there's a deep, quiet competence that comes from knowing you can provide for your family directly from the land and your own ingenuity. This competence is your armor, your strength, and often your only recognized power in a world structured to favor men. As a young girl in the Middle Ages, Your childhood isn't quite what a modern child would recognize. There aren't dedicated playrooms, mountains of toys, or even the concept of prolonged, carefree innocence. Instead, your world is one of observation, imitation, and gradual integration into the adult sphere. From the moment you can toddle, you're learning. You watch your mother, your grandmother, and the other women of the household, absorbing every movement, every task. This isn't just curiosity, it's an apprenticeship for your entire future. A mainstream historical fact is that childhood, as a distinct phase with its own unique needs and considerations, was a concept that largely developed later in history. For you, childhood is a brief prelude to adulthood, a time when you are gradually, almost imperceptibly, eased into the responsibilities that await. You might be handed a small broom at 5 to sweep the packed earth floor, or tasked with gathering kindling from the nearby woods, your tiny hands gripping sticks that feel enormous. Perhaps you learn to sort dried herbs, or to carefully pluck feathers from a goose. There are no formal lessons in reading or writing. For most girls, unless you happen to be born into a very wealthy noble family or destined for a convent, your education is practical, experiential, and utterly vital for survival. You learn the rhythm of churning butter, the delicate touch needed to spin flax into thread, or the correct way to knead dough for the day's bread. It's all real-world application. You learn by doing, by watching, by failing, and by trying again. A quirky tidbit is that even the games you play often mimic adult activities. You might see girls playing with dolls made of rags or wood, teaching them imaginary chores, or boys jousting with sticks. There's a subtle but constant reinforcement of gender roles, right from the earliest age. You understand, implicitly, that your path will be different from your brother's. He might be learning to handle a plow or a sword. You are learning to manage a home, a garden, and eventually a family. Historians still argue whether medieval children were viewed simply as miniature adults, or if there was an unspoken understanding of their unique developmental stages, even without a formal concept of childhood. Regardless, the pressure to contribute is palpable. Your days aren't without moments of simple joy, though: the warmth of the sun on your face as you gather berries, the shared laughter with other girls while fetching water, the comfort of a story told by the firelight. These are your small treasures. But underlying it all is the knowledge of your future. Your role is largely predetermined by your birth. If you are a peasant girl, you will likely marry a peasant boy from your village or a nearby one, and your life will continue the cycle of agricultural labor. If you were born into a merchant family, you might learn arithmetic and how to manage ledgers, preparing to assist in the family business. And if you are a noblewoman, your future will involve intricate social maneuvering, managing vast estates, and producing heirs. You're taught obedience and piety, virtues considered paramount for medieval women. Your spiritual education, if nothing else, is robust. You learn prayers, saint stories, and the importance of church doctrine from a young age, often sitting beside your mother in the local church, listening to sermons delivered in Latin, a language you might not fully understand, but whose reverence you certainly feel. The stories you hear, both sacred and secular, often reinforce the roles you are expected to embody: the dutiful daughter, the chaste wife, the pious mother. There's a quiet understanding that your value in this society is tied to your ability to fulfill these roles successfully and to contribute to the well-being and continuation of your family and community. You are not just a child, you are a future pillar of the household economy and social structure. If your birth was into a noble family, your childhood, while still brief by modern standards, diverged significantly from that of a peasant girl. You might not be fetching water from a well or weeding a field, but your days are far from idle. Instead, you are being groomed for a life of management, strategy, and social influence. A mainstream historical fact is that noblewomen, far from being mere decorative figures, were often the administrators of vast estates when their husbands were away at war, on crusades, or at court. Your world is one of complex hierarchies, intricate social codes, and immense responsibility. Imagine yourself rising with the sun, not to the crowing of a rooster in a tiny hovel, but within the stone walls of a castle or a sprawling manor house. Your first tasks might involve overseeing the preparation of breakfast for dozens, if not hundreds, of household members, from knights and squires to servants and cooks. You delegate tasks, ensure provisions are accounted for, and manage the general flow of the household. This isn't simply telling people what to do. It's a constant logistical puzzle, requiring sharp wit and an even sharper memory. You'd know how much grain was left in the stores, how many chickens were ready for slaughter, and if the latest batch of candles would last through the winter. Your education, unlike that of your peasant counterparts, might include a degree of literacy, especially if you were destined for a politically significant marriage or a life in a convent. You might learn to read and write in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship, and perhaps even in French or English, depending on your region and family connections. You'd study history, theology, and perhaps even basic arithmetic. To manage the estate's finances, a quirky tidbit is that some noblewomen were highly skilled in falconry, a popular medieval sport, indicating a level of outdoor activity and training that might surprise modern assumptions about delicate ladies. You'd ride horses, command hunting parties, and possibly even participate in the strategic breeding of falcons and hounds. Historians still argue whether the perceived power of noblewomen was truly their own, or merely an extension of their husbands' authority to be wielded on his behalf. Regardless, your practical influence is undeniable. You are often the central figure connecting the various parts of the estate, from the agricultural lands to the workshops and the domestic staff. You might be the primary caregiver for your children, or at least oversee their wet nurses and tutors, ensuring their proper upbringing and education, which is crucial for the continuation of your family line and its status beyond the daily administration. You are a vital participant in the intricate dance of medieval politics and social life. You host visiting dignitaries, manage lavish feasts, and play a crucial role in negotiating marriage alliances for your children, which are often the bedrock of your family's power and influence. Your needlework, far from a mere pastime, could be a form of artistic expression and a means of demonstrating your family's wealth and prestige. Through elaborate tapestries and embroidered garments, you might spend hours in the sola, a private room, working on intricate patterns, perhaps even depicting historical events or biblical scenes. This quiet, focused work is not just a leisure activity. It's a demonstration of refined skill and patience, virtues highly prized in your social sphere. Your life is a constant balance between the practical demands of running a large household and the social obligations of maintaining your family's standing. While noblewomen manage their grand estates, if you were a peasant woman in the Middle Ages, your daily realities were a relentless cycle of physical labor, dictated by the land and the seasons. Your life was inextricably linked to the earth, a demanding, often unforgiving partner. A mainstream historical fact is that over 90% of the medieval population lived in rural areas, making the experiences of peasant women representative of the vast majority. You didn't just live on the land. You lived from it, and you worked it ceaselessly. Imagine the feel of rough, homespun wool against your skin as you rise before dawn, often in a small, smoky hut shared with your family and possibly some livestock. There's no leisurely morning. Every moment counts. Your first tasks might involve lighting the fire, fetching water from the communal weller, heavy, cold trek, often multiple times a day, and preparing the meager morning meal, perhaps just some gruel or stale bread. Then it's out to the fields. You might be involved in ploughing, guiding the oxen, or pushing the heavy wooden plough alongside the men, your muscles straining with every step in the muddy or frozen earth. Or perhaps you're scattering seeds by hand, your movements precise and practiced, knowing that the family's survival depends on a good harvest. Weeding is an endless task, back-breaking and tedious, as you crawl along rows, plucking out unwanted growth that threatens the precious crops. During harvest season, the labor intensifies dramatically. You're bent double for hours, cutting grain with a sickle, binding sheaves, or gathering hay. The sun beats down, your hands ache, and your back screams, but you cannot stop. Every sheaf gathered his food for your family through the lean winter months. A quirky tidbit is that medieval peasant women were often as strong, if not stronger, than many of the men, given the sheer physical demands of their daily lives. You wouldn't be a delicate flower. You'd be a powerhouse of practical resilience. Beyond the fields, your domestic duties are equally demanding. You are responsible for grinding grain into flour, often at the Lord's mill, which takes time and energy, and often a portion of your precious yield. You bake bread in communal ovens, tend to a small garden of herbs and vegetables, and care for the family's animals, whether it's milking a cow, feeding chickens, or mucking out the pigsty. You're also the primary producer of clothing for your family. This involves everything from shearing sheep to cleaning and carding wool, spinning thread on a drop spindle while you walk or tend other tasks, and finally weaving the cloth on a loom. Then you'd cut and sew garments by hand. It's an entire textile industry rolled into one person. Historians still argue whether peasant women's contributions were fully recognized or if their immense labor was simply taken for granted within the patriarchal structure of medieval society. You are also the primary caregiver for your children, carrying them with you to the fields or leaving them in the care of an older sibling while you work. Childbirth, too, is a rural affair, often assisted only by other village women, a perilous event with high mortality rates for both mother and child. Your life is one of constant production and reproduction, inextricably linked to the cycles of nature and the demands of survival. There's little room for personal leisure or ambition. Your worth is measured by your ability to sustain your family and contribute to the collective effort of the village. It's a hard life, certainly, but one filled with a quiet strength and an intimate connection to the earth that few modern lives can truly comprehend. For you, a medieval woman, marriage wasn't primarily about romantic love as we understand it today. Instead, it was an economic, social, and political alliance, a fundamental building block of medieval society. A mainstream historical fact is that arranged marriages were the norm across all social classes, driven by the need for land, labor, heirs, or strategic alliances. You didn't necessarily choose your spouse, your family did, with practicality often outweighing personal preference. Imagine The day your parents inform you of your impending marriage. If you're a peasant girl, your husband might be a young man from your own village, or a neighboring one, known to your family for his strength and his ability to work the land. The dowry in your case might be modest, a few chickens, a cow, some household linens, or perhaps just your strong, capable hands. The ceremony itself would be relatively simple, perhaps a blessing by the local priest, followed by a communal feast. You might have known your husband since childhood, or he could be a complete stranger. Your connection would grow through shared labor and the mutual goal of survival, rather than a whirlwind romance. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, a medieval betrothal or spousal was legally binding even without a formal church wedding, making it difficult to back out once the promises were made. A sort of prenuptial agreement, but with more divine oversight. If you are a noblewoman, your marriage is a far more elaborate and politically charged affair. You might be betrothed as a child, perhaps even before you remember, to cement alliances between powerful families. Your future husband could be from a distant land, a different culture, and significantly older than you. Your dowry would be substantial. Lands, castles, vast sums of money, or even political influence, all carefully negotiated by your families. The wedding itself would be a grand spectacle, a public affirmation of the new bond between two powerful houses, attended by nobles, knights, and clergy. You might meet your husband for the first time just days or hours before the ceremony. Your role in this union is to bear heirs, particularly sons, to secure the family line and prevent valuable lands from passing out of your family's control. Historians still argue whether women had any real agency in their marriage choices, even if nominally they could refuse consent. While outright force was sometimes used, subtle pressures, economic realities, and family honor often made genuine refusal an impossibility. You are, in many ways, a pawn in a larger game, but a very valuable pawn indeed, especially if you are fertile and well-connected. The legal age for marriage was surprisingly young by modern standards. Girls could be married as young as 12, though consummation might be delayed. This isn't to say every girl was married off at such a tender age. It varied widely by region and class. Often, marriages occurred in the late teens or early 20s, particularly for peasant women who needed to be physically mature enough to manage a household and endure. Childbirth, your new life as a wife, begins immediately. If you're a peasant, you integrate into your husband's family, joining the collective labor force of their farm. If you're a noble, you travel to your new husband's estate, taking on the monumental task of managing his household and preparing for your primary duty. Procreation, the expectation of fidelity, is absolute for you, while for men it is often more leniently applied. Your reputation, and by extension your family's, hinges on your chastity before marriage and your loyalty within it. It's a pragmatic arrangement designed for stability, survival, and the continuation of lineages, a far cry from the love match narratives that dominate our modern understanding of marriage. With marriage, your primary purpose in medieval society, particularly for women, shifted irrevocably towards motherhood and procreation. The expectation to bear children, especially sons, was immense, not just for personal joy, but for the continuation of family lines, the inheritance of property, and the provision of labor. A mainstream historical fact is that childbirth was the single most dangerous event in a medieval woman's life, carrying a significant risk of death for both mother and infant imagined the anxiety that must have accompanied each pregnancy. There were no prenatal classes, no detailed scans, no emergency C-sections. You relied on the wisdom of older women, the local midwife, and perhaps a handful of herbal remedies. You would feel the life growing within you, a mixture of anticipation and dread. The moment of labor itself would often take place in your home, surrounded by women, your mother, sisters, neighbors, the midwife, who offered what comfort and practical assistance they could. The birthing bed was often just a mattress on the floor, or you might even squat or stand, using gravity to assist. Pain management, largely non-existent beyond prayers and perhaps a strong drink. The process could be agonizing, protracted, and terrifying. Complications, which are routinely managed with modern medicine, were often fatal. Infection was a constant threat, and even successful births could leave you weakened and vulnerable. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval medical texts, often drawing on ancient Greek and Roman ideas, included peculiar advice for difficult births, such as having the pregnant woman shake a piece of jasper or placing a lodestone on her thigh. While these might seem strange to us, they reflect a desperate attempt to find solutions in a world where medical understanding was rudimentary. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rates led to a detachment from infants or a more profound, albeit often brief, bond given the constant threat of loss. You might experience the joy of holding a healthy newborn, tiny and vulnerable, a testament to your endurance. But you also lived with the stark reality that many of your children might not survive infancy or early childhood due to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Baptism was crucial and often performed quickly, sometimes even minutes after birth, to ensure the infant's soul would go to heaven if it died. As a mother, your days would be filled with the care of infants and young children. You would breastfeed your babies, often for extended periods, as it was safer than cow's milk and the only reliable source of nutrition. If you were a noblewoman, you might employ a wet nurse, but even then, you would oversee the care and upbringing of your offspring. You'd teach your daughters the skills they needed for household management and domestic duties, just as your mother taught you. For your sons, you'd prepare them for their future roles, whether in the fields, in the workshop, or in the court. Discipline was often strict, reflecting the harsh realities of medieval life where children needed to learn obedience and resilience quickly. Your identity as a woman was deeply intertwined with your ability to bear and raise children. A barren woman might face social stigma and even be seen as a burden, as she couldn't contribute to the continuation of the family line or provide labor for the household. While love for your children undoubtedly existed, the societal pressure to procreate transformed motherhood from a personal experience into a profound societal obligation, fraught with both immense danger and profound significance. In the Middle Ages, your understanding of health and illness was vastly different from our modern scientific perspective. Instead of germ theory or advanced diagnostics, you navigated a world where sickness was often attributed to imbalances in the body's humors, divine displeasure, or even malevolent supernatural forces. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was a blend of ancient Greek and Roman theories, folk remedies, and Christian beliefs, often with limited practical efficacy. Imagine feeling a fever gripping your body. You wouldn't reach for a thermometer or a pill bottle. Instead, a village healer, perhaps an older woman with generations of herbal knowledge, might be called upon. She would likely feel your pulse, examine your tongue, and ask about your symptoms, trying to determine which of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow, bile or black bile was out of balance. Too much blood, and you might be prescribed a bleeding, too much phlegm, and perhaps a warm, dry compress. Your treatment options were often simple, sometimes painful, and occasionally quite peculiar. A quirky tidbit is the use of uroscopy, or urine examination, which was a surprisingly common diagnostic tool. Doctors, if you were wealthy enough to consult one, would meticulously inspect the color, clarity, and even smell of your urine, believing it held clues to your internal state. They might even taste it, which, let's be honest, sounds like a truly unpleasant job perk. These observations, combined with astrological charts, would inform their diagnosis and treatment. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practices, despite their lack of modern scientific grounding, offered more psychological comfort than actual physical cures, especially when compared to the brutal surgical interventions often performed without anesthesia. You would certainly hope for a gentle remedy, like an herbal poultice for a wound, or a soothing decoction for a cough. You'd learn to gather specific herbs from the surrounding fields and forests: chamomile for sleep, plantain for cuts, willow, bark for pain. This practical knowledge, passed down through generations of women, was often your primary healthcare system. For more serious ailments, your options were grim. Infections were rampant, and a simple cut could quickly become life-threatening. Childbirth, as we discussed, was incredibly perilous. Superstition also played a significant role. If you fell ill, you might wear amulets to ward off evil, perform specific prayers, or even undertake a pilgrimage to a holy site, hoping for a miraculous cure. The church played a large role in healthcare, with monasteries often maintaining infirmaries and providing care. Though their methods were also rooted in humoral theory and spiritual intervention, dental care was virtually non-existent, so you'd likely suffer from toothaches and infections. Hygiene, as we'll explore later, was basic, contributing to the spread of disease. Your resilience in the face of constant physical discomfort and illness would be remarkable. You learned to live with ailments that modern medicine would swiftly cure, finding strength in faith, community support, and the enduring wisdom of traditional remedies. It's a testament to the human body's fortitude that anyone survived past childhood, let alone thrived. When you think about clothing in the Middle Ages, cast aside any notions of fast fashion or extensive wardrobes. For you, a medieval woman, your garments were primarily practical, durable, and reflective of your social standing. Fashion was less about fleeting trends and more about functionality and subtle markers of status. A mainstream historical fact is that sumptuary laws, which dictated what people of different social classes could wear, were common throughout the medieval period, ensuring that everyone literally knew their place. Imagine getting dressed in the morning. If you're a peasant woman, your attire is simple and robust. You'd likely start with a long, loose-fitting linen chemise or shift as your innermost layer. Over that, you'd pull on a long, shapeless tunic or kirtle, often made of coarse wool or linen, dyed with natural, muted colors like brown, gray, or undyed off-white. The fabric would be rough against your skin, providing warmth and protection from the elements. You might wear an apron for practical reasons, and a simple head covering, perhaps a piece of cloth or a wimple, was essential. This isn't just for modesty. It also keeps your hair clean and out of the way during work. A quirky tidbit: even for peasants, having a slightly nicer Sunday best outfit, often in a slightly brighter color if dyes were available, was a common aspiration, used for church or special village gatherings. Your clothing had to withstand relentless physical labor, bending, stretching, kneeling in fields, and enduring harsh weather. Tears would be mended repeatedly, and garments would be worn until they literally fell apart. Shoes, if you had them, would be simple leather turn shoes, sometimes just leather wrapped around your feet, protecting them from stones and mud. In winter, layers were key, perhaps a thicker wool cloak or shawl to ward off the biting cold. Your entire wardrobe might consist of only 2 or 3 outfits. If you are a noblewoman, your clothing is far more elaborate, expensive, and restrictive. You still wear a linen chemise, but over it, your kirtle might be made of finer wool, silk, or even velvet, dyed in rich, vibrant colors like deep reds, blues, or greens, using costly imported dyes. Your outer garment, perhaps a cote hardie or a hoopyland, would be beautifully tailored, perhaps with long, flowing sleeves, and sometimes adorned with furs, embroidery, or even small jewels. Your fabric choices alone would scream your wealth. A restrictive corset-like garment might be worn to achieve a desired silhouette, and the sheer weight of multiple layers of heavy fabric could be cumbersome. Your headwear would be a significant indicator of your status, from simple veils and wimples that covered your hair and neck to elaborate hennins, tall, cone-shaped hats with flowing veils or intricate padded rolls. Your headdress would be a complex structure, sometimes requiring pins and wires to hold it in place. Hair, particularly for married women, was usually covered, seen as a mark of modesty and marital status. Jewelry, if you were wealthy, would include rings, brooches, and necklaces, often with religious significance or family crests. Historians still argue whether medieval fashion was driven more by practicality and social stratification, or by a surprisingly robust sense of individual, albeit constrained, aesthetic choice. You would spend a considerable amount of time preparing your appearance, especially for public events or courtly gatherings. The layers, the fastenings, the intricate headwear, it all speaks to a slower pace of life, where dressing was a ritual, not a rushed daily task. And remember, washing these elaborate garments was a huge undertaking, so they weren't laundered daily, or even weekly. The concept of freshly washed was a rare luxury. Your daily sustenance in the Middle Ages was inextricably linked to your social standing, with a stark contrast between the meager fare of the peasantry and the lavish feasts of the nobility. When we talk about food and drink, you're not thinking about calorie counts or balanced diets. You're thinking about survival and, if you're lucky, indulgence. A mainstream historical fact is that grain, particularly bread, was the absolute staple of the medieval diet across all social classes, forming the bulk of almost every meal. Imagine your breakfast as a peasant woman. It's likely a hunk of coarse dark bread, perhaps made from rye or barley, perhaps a bowl of gruel, a thin porridge made from boiled grains or vegetables, with water. Meat is a rare luxury, perhaps only eaten on feast days or when a hunt is successful. Your protein might come from eggs if you keep chickens, or occasionally from fish if you live near a river or coast. Though even then, there are restrictions on who can fish where. Vegetables would be those you could grow in your small garden. Cabbage, onions, peas, beans. Fruits would be seasonal and gathered from local trees. Your drink, mostly water, often from a communal well, or weak ale or cider, which was safer too. Drink than water in many places due to the brewing process killing bacteria. A quirky tidbit: medieval peasants often ate their meals directly off a thick slice of stale bread called a trencher, which would soak up the juices and then often be given to the poor or to the dogs, functioning as a disposable plate. Now, shift your perspective to a noblewoman's table. Your breakfast might still involve bread, but it would be fine white bread made from superior wheat flour, a mark of your status. Your table would groan under the weight of roasted meats, venison, boar, poultry, and various game birds, often seasoned with expensive, imported spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. Fish, prepared in myriad ways, would be common, especially on fast days mandated by the church. You'd have a wider array of vegetables and fruits, some grown in castle gardens, others preserved or imported. Sauces, rich and complex, would accompany almost every dish. Your drink would be fine wine, often diluted with water or stronger ale. A sweet treat, perhaps dried fruits, nuts, or even rudimentary pastries, might follow the main courses. Historians still argue whether the dietary differences contributed significantly to the varying lifespans between social classes, with the peasant diet often lacking essential nutrients, especially during lean times. You, as a noblewoman, would dine with an array of cutlery. Though forks were still relatively new and not universally used, so you'd still rely on knives, and your fingers. Feasts would be elaborate affairs, lasting for hours, with entertainment from musicians and jesters. You'd watch and participate in this ritual of consumption, which reinforced your family's power and generosity. For everyone, the availability of food was deeply tied to the agricultural cycle. A bad harvest meant hardship, even famine, for peasants, and reduced variety for nobles. Food preservation was vital. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying were common methods. There were no refrigerators, so fresh food was truly fresh. The preparation of food was a monumental task, particularly in large noble households, involving numerous servants and specialized cooks. As a woman, regardless of your status, you would likely be involved in some aspect of food preparation or oversight, from gardening and preserving to directing the kitchen staff. Your relationship with food was intimate, a daily dance with the seasons, the land, and the constant need to nourish yourself and your family. The concept of education and literacy in the Middle Ages was a patchwork, vastly different for men and women, and heavily dependent on your social class and location. For you, a medieval woman, formal schooling as we know it was a rare privilege, but learning, in its broader sense, was an unavoidable part of life. A mainstream historical fact is that literacy rates were generally very low across medieval Europe, with the ability to read and write largely confined to the clergy and a small percentage of the nobility and burgeoning merchant class. Imagine your early learning. If you're a peasant woman, your education is entirely practical and oral. You learn by doing, by observing, and by being taught directly by your mother and other older women. You master skills essential for survival: farming, techniques, food preservation, spinning and weaving, herbal law, childcare. These aren't lessons from books. They are lessons from life itself, passed down through generations. Your ability to read or write would be virtually non-existent, and frankly, unnecessary for your daily tasks. Information spreads through spoken word, through community gatherings, and through the local priest's sermons. A quirky tidbit: despite low formal literacy, storytelling and memorization were highly valued skills. You might know dozens of folk tales, songs, and proverbs by heart, passed down through the family. which served as both entertainment and repositories of wisdom. Historians still argue whether the lack of formal literacy for most women meant they were truly uneducated, or if their vast practical knowledge and oral traditions constituted a different, equally valid form of education. You would know the names of countless plants, the signs of changing weather, the intricacies of animal husbandry, and the precise timing for various agricultural tasks. This practical knowledge was vital for the survival of your family and community. If you are a noblewoman, your educational path is significantly different. You might be tutored at home by a chaplain, a governess, or even a visiting scholar. Your studies would likely focus on religious texts, potentially Latin, history, and perhaps basic arithmetic for managing household accounts. You might learn to read and write, enabling you to manage correspondence, read devotional books, or even engage in intellectual pursuits. Some noble women were highly educated, corresponding with scholars and even composing their own works. Think of figures like Hildegard of Bingen. Though she was a nun, her intellectual pursuits were often supported by aristocratic families sending their daughters to convents. Or Christine de Pizan. You might also learn skills considered appropriate for your station: embroidery, playing a musical instrument like a lute, or composing poetry. These were not mere hobbies. They were accomplishments that enhanced your marriage prospects and social standing. For some women, particularly those drawn to a religious life, the convent offered the most extensive educational opportunities. Here, you could learn to read and write Latin, study theology, copy manuscripts, and even contribute to scholarship. Convents were centers of learning and literacy for women, providing an intellectual space that was largely unavailable elsewhere. This was a place where you could pursue intellectual curiosity, unburdened by the immediate demands of marriage and family. Regardless of your background, your education was geared towards your predetermined societal role. For the peasant, it was survival. For the noblewoman, it was management and social graces. For the nun, it was spiritual devotion and scholarship. The world of letters might have been largely closed to many, but the world of practical knowledge, passed from woman to woman, was always open, ensuring that vital traditions and skills endured through the generations. In the Middle Ages, religion was not just a part of life, it was the framework for existence, permeating every aspect of society, from daily routines to major life events. For you, a medieval woman, your spiritual life was deeply woven into your identity, offering solace, purpose, and sometimes a path to influence. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman Catholic Church held immense power and authority across Western Europe, dictating moral codes, celebrating holidays, and providing a sense of order and community. Imagine your week revolving around the rhythm of the church bells, summoning you to prayer. You would attend Mass, perhaps daily if you were devout and had the leisure, but certainly on Sundays and major feast days. The sermons, delivered in Latin, might be partially incomprehensible, but the rituals, the incense, the stained glass windows if your local church had them, and the communal singing of hymns would create an immersive, spiritual experience. You would learn the lives of the saints, emulating the virtues of figures like the Virgin Mary, piety, humility, and submission, which were often held up as ideals for women. You'd participate in religious processions, offer prayers for your family's well-being, and give alms to the poor if you could afford it, believing it would secure your salvation. A quirky tidbit is the widespread belief in the power of relics. You might travel to a distant shrine to venerate the bone of a saint or a fragment of the true cross, believing these objects held miraculous healing powers or could intercede on your behalf. These pilgrimages, though arduous, were often deeply meaningful spiritual journeys, offering a rare chance to travel and experience the world beyond your immediate village. Historians still argue whether medieval women's piety was genuinely fervent, or a societal expectation forced upon them, given the limited alternatives for a fulfilling life outside marriage and domesticity. Regardless, many women found deep personal meaning in their faith. For some, religion offered an alternative path to the prescribed roles of wife and mother. Entering a convent was a profound decision, often requiring a dowry, a spiritual dowry, if you will, but it offered a unique sanctuary. Within convent walls, you could escape the dangers of childbirth, the drudgery of endless domestic tasks, and the political machinations of the secular world. As a nun, you would dedicate your life to prayer, study, and often intellectual pursuits. Convents were centers of learning where you could become literate, copy manuscripts, engage in theological debate, and even hold positions of significant authority as an abbess, managing large estates and overseeing other nuns. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a prominent abbess, mystic, composer, and writer, exemplify the intellectual and spiritual power some women achieved within the church. You might also find a spiritual outlet as a beguine, a laywoman who lived in a semi-monastic community, dedicating herself to piety and good works without taking formal vows, often supporting herself through weaving or other crafts. This offered a degree of independence and communal support that was rare for unmarried women. Your religious devotion was not just passive attendance. It was an active force in your life, shaping your moral compass, providing comfort in times of hardship, and for some, offering a pathway to a life of intellectual and spiritual fulfillment beyond the confines of traditional gender roles. While the image of a medieval woman often conjures visions of domesticity, for many, life extended well beyond the confines of the home or castle walls into various forms of economic contribution and work. Your labor, whether paid or unpaid, was vital to the functioning of medieval society. A mainstream historical fact is that women were actively involved in a wide array of trades and crafts, especially in urban centers, demonstrating an economic agency often overlooked. Imagine yourself in a bustling medieval town. You might not be a peasant toiling in the fields, but your day is still filled with productive labor. Perhaps you are a brewer, turning grains into ale, a staple drink for almost everyone, safer than water in many urban environments. You'd oversee the mashing, fermentation, and bottling. Your knowledge of the process crucial for a good, consistent product. Or perhaps you're a baker, kneading dough before dawn, stoking the communal oven, and selling fresh loaves from a stall. The smell of warm bread would cling to your clothes. You might be a spinner or weaver, processing raw wool or flax into thread and then fabric. This was often a home-based industry, but essential. You could also be a dyer, creating vibrant colors from natural pigments, a messy but skilled trade. If you lived near a market, you might be a vendor, selling surplus eggs, chickens, vegetables from your garden, or perhaps goods you've crafted yourself. Your voice would join the cacophony of the marketplace, haggling and calling out your wares. A quirky tidbit: some women in port towns were even involved in the highly physical and often dangerous work of fishing or processing fish for sale, gutting and salting catches alongside the men. Historians still argue whether women's economic contributions were undervalued compared to men's, or if the nature of their work simply made it less visible in formal records. Regardless, your work was fundamental. If you were married to a craftsman, say a shoemaker or a tailor, you would almost certainly be your husband's informal partner. You'd assist in every stage of the production process, preparing materials, managing accounts, dealing with customers, and even performing skilled aspects of the craft. Many wives effectively ran the business side of a workshop, freeing their husbands to focus on the manual labor. When a craftsman died, it was often his widow who took over the business, sometimes for many years, proving her competence and skill. You might also find work as a domestic servant in a wealthier household, which, while offering stability, often meant long hours and little personal freedom. Or perhaps you'd work in textile production, cleaning wool, spinning thread, or weaving cloth for export. In agricultural communities, beyond fieldwork, women were responsible for the crucial processing of harvests, threshing grain, drying herbs, making cheese and butter, and preserving meats. This wasn't just housework. It was the fundamental processing that ensured food security for the entire year. Your work was often physically demanding and rarely ceased. From dawn to dusk, you were a producer, a manager, a vital cog in the medieval economy. Your hands were rarely idle, and your contribution, though often unsung in the grand historical narratives, was absolutely indispensable to the survival and prosperity of your family and community. In the Middle Ages, your standing in the eyes of the law was a complex and often contradictory affair, heavily influenced by custom, social class, and the pervasive patriarchal structures of the time. While you were certainly a legal subject, your rights and limitations were often different from those of men. A mainstream historical fact is that English common law, which influenced much of medieval European legal practice, largely viewed women as being under the legal guardianship of their fathers before marriage and their husbands afterward, a concept known as coverture. Imagine yourself needing to navigate the legal system. If you were a single woman, a spinster, or a widow, you possessed more legal autonomy. You could own property, enter into contracts, bring lawsuits, and represent yourself in court. This freedom, however, often came with the vulnerability of not having a male protector in a society where powerful men often held sway. A quirky tidbit: some medieval legal codes had specific provisions, though often harsh, for women accused of slander or gossip, reflecting societal anxieties about female speech. The scold's bridle or brank was a particularly nasty device, a metal muzzle sometimes fitted onto women for public humiliation. If you were married, the situation changed dramatically. Under coverture, your legal identity was largely subsumed by your husband's. You generally couldn't own property independently, sign contracts without his consent, or sue or be sued in your own name. Your husband legally controlled any property you brought into the marriage as a dowry, though typically he couldn't sell it without your consent. Your earnings, if you worked outside the home, legally belonged to him. This wasn't necessarily meant to disempower you entirely. It was often framed as a way to protect the family unit and its assets, with the husband acting as the legal head. However, it clearly limited your individual agency. Historians still argue whether coverture truly rendered married women powerless, or if informal customs and community pressure often allowed women more practical agency than the strict letter of the law suggested. For instance, while your husband controlled your property, he also had a legal obligation to support you and your children. If he failed in this, you could sometimes seek legal redress. In some urban areas, and particularly within certain merchant guilds, married women might retain more independent legal rights, especially if they were active in their husband's business or ran their own. These were often exceptions to the general rule. Your legal protections, especially against violence, were also limited. Domestic abuse was rarely interfered with by external authorities unless it became extreme or affected public order. Divorce, as we understand it, was virtually non-existent. Marriages could be annulled by the church under very specific circumstances, but not simply ended by mutual consent. If your marriage broke down, you might seek refuge in a convent or return to your birth family, but your legal options were few. Despite these limitations, you were not entirely without recourse. You could testify in court, bring charges against certain crimes, and sometimes petition authorities directly. In some cases, particularly concerning property disputes or guardianship of children, women appeared in court and argued their cases, demonstrating a surprising resilience and understanding of the legal labyrinth. Your legal existence was constrained, certainly, but not entirely erased. You existed within a framework that privileged male authority, but within that framework, you often found ways to exert influence, protect your interests, and navigate the complex web of medieval justice. Closely intertwined with your legal rights, your ability to own property and inheritance in the Middle Ages was a complex, often frustrating, and highly variable aspect of your life, deeply influenced by local customs, social class, and the presence or absence of male relatives. This wasn't simply about personal wealth, it was about security, status, and your very means of survival. A mainstream historical fact is that while primogeniture inheritance by the eldest son was common, especially among the nobility, women were not entirely excluded from inheriting or controlling property. Imagine your father's death. If you were his only child, and particularly if you were a noblewoman, you might become an heiress, inheriting vast lands, castles, and titles. This would make you an incredibly valuable commodity in the marriage market, as your husband would gain control of your inheritance. However, this control was often conditional. He might not be able to sell or alienate your inherited lands without your consent, and upon his death, they might revert to you or pass to your children, rather than his own kin. A quirky tidbit: in some parts of medieval Europe, particularly among peasant communities, a system called gavelkind meant that land was divided more equally among all children, including daughters, offering them a small but significant stake in the family's assets. For most women, however, direct inheritance of land was less common than a dowry or dower. Your dowry, given by your family to your husband upon marriage, was intended to support you within the marriage and, crucially, to ensure your financial security should you become a widow. It wasn't legally yours, but it was understood to be, for your maintenance. The dower, on the other hand, was a portion of your husband's property, often 1/3, that was set aside for your use should he die before you. This dower was your legal right and could not be alienated by your husband. It was designed to ensure that you, as a widow, would not become destitute. Historians still argue whether the dower system truly empowered widows or simply provided a basic subsistence, as it rarely matched the wealth you might have managed as a married woman. As a widow, your legal status improved dramatically. You regained your legal independence, able to manage your dower lands, engage in business, and live without male guardianship. This is why many medieval widows were surprisingly influential figures, managing estates, engaging in trade, and even acting as regents for their underage sons. You might even choose not to remarry, enjoying your newfound autonomy. For peasant women, property often meant livestock, tools, or household goods, rather than vast tracts of land. Your inheritance might be a few chickens, a spinning wheel, or a share in the family's crops. While not grand, these were essential for your livelihood. In some customary systems, daughters might inherit alongside sons, particularly in the absence of male heirs, ensuring that the land remained within the family, even if through a female line. The complexities of property and inheritance laws meant that your financial security was a constant concern. Your vulnerability as a single woman, your temporary loss of legal identity upon marriage, and your potential empowerment as a widow all shaped your economic reality. These systems, while seemingly restrictive from a modern perspective, were designed to maintain social order, ensure familial continuity, and provide at least a basic level of support for women throughout their various life stages. While the medieval image of warfare often focuses on knights and battles, if you were a medieval woman, warfare's impact on your life was profound, pervasive, and often devastating, whether you were on the battlefield's edge or miles away. You weren't a passive bystander. You were a survivor, a supporter, and sometimes a victim of conflict. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval warfare was brutal and often involved long sieges, which disproportionately affected civilian populations, especially women and children. Imagine the news of an approaching army. Panic would ripple through your village or town. If you were in a rural area, you might gather what few valuables you possessed, perhaps a handful of grain, some tools, a cherished piece of cloth, and flee into the surrounding forests or seek refuge in a fortified church, hoping to escape the raiders. If your village lay in the path of marching armies, you faced the terror of pillage, rape, and destruction. Your crops could be trampled, your livestock stolen, and your home burned, leaving you utterly destitute. A quirky tidbit: some women became adept at hiding their valuables, burying them in secret caches in their gardens or in the woods, hoping to return to them after the danger passed. If you lived within the walls of a castle or walled town, you faced the ordeal of a siege. Days would turn into weeks, weeks into months, as supplies dwindled. You would be part of the collective effort to survive. You might help prepare food for the defenders, boil water, tend to the wounded, or even participate in the defense of the walls, throwing stones or pouring boiling water on attackers. Your fear overridden by a desperate need to protect your home and family. The constant threat of starvation, disease, and direct assault would be your daily reality. Historians still argue whether the stories of women actively fighting in defense of castles are rare anomalies, or if many more participated than the historical records typically show. Even if battles were distant, the ripple effects of war shaped your life. Men would be conscripted, leaving you to manage farms, businesses, and families alone. You became the de facto head of the household, taking on traditionally male labor alongside your own. You'd contend with disrupted trade routes, leading to shortages and inflated prices for essential goods. If your husband or sons were away at war, you'd live with constant anxiety, never knowing if they would return. The wives and mothers of soldiers often became camp followers, enduring harsh conditions as they provided vital support services, cooking, mending clothes, nursing the sick, or sometimes less savory ones. When the fighting finally ceased, your work was far from over. You faced the arduous task of rebuilding. Homes needed to be repaired, fields replanted, and communities restored. If you were widowed by war, you faced the daunting prospect of raising children alone, with limited resources and potentially without the legal or social protections that a husband would have provided. The scars of war, both physical and psychological, would linger for years, if not a lifetime. Your resilience in the face of such widespread destruction and loss is a testament to the enduring human spirit, finding ways to mend, to nourish, and to carry on, even when everything around you had been laid to waste. Your experience of daily life in the Middle Ages would differ dramatically depending on whether you resided in a bustling urban center or a quiet, self-sufficient rural village. These two worlds offered distinct challenges, opportunities, and rhythms of existence for you as a medieval woman. A mainstream historical fact is that while the vast majority of people lived in rural areas, medieval towns and cities experienced significant growth, becoming centers of trade, craft, and learning. Imagine yourself as a woman in a medieval town. The air would be thick with the smells of baking bread, tanning leather, unwashed bodies, and sewage. Sounds would be a constant cacophony: the clang of blacksmiths, the cries of street vendors, the chatter of merchants, the clip-clop of horses, and carts on cobblestones. Your dwelling would likely be smaller, possibly a multi-story building with a shop on the ground floor and living quarters above. Space is at a premium, and you'd live in close proximity to your neighbors, sharing walls, wells, and sometimes even privies. Your days would be driven by the demands of trade or craft. You might be involved in selling goods at market, assisting your husband in his workshop, or running your own small business, perhaps as a weaver, a baker, or an alewife. Access to goods and services is far greater here. You could buy spices from distant lands, hire skilled laborers, and access legal systems more readily. A quirky tidbit is that medieval towns often had strict curfews enforced by watchmen, and the gates would be locked at night, creating a strong sense of community but also a feeling of being contained. Now, contrast this with life in a rural village. Here, the pace is slower, dictated by the sun and the seasons. The smells are of damp earth, wood smoke, livestock, and growing crops. Sounds are natural: birdsong, the rustling of leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the chatter of a handful of neighbors you've known your entire life. Your home would be a simple, often single-room dwelling, perhaps thatched with a dirt floor. Your life is entirely agricultural. Your time is spent in the fields, tending a garden, collecting water, preparing food from scratch, and caring for livestock. The nearest market town might be a day's walk away, making exotic goods, luxuries you rarely encounter. Your social circle is small, intimate, and deeply interconnected. Everyone knows everyone else, for better or worse. And community support is vital for survival during harsh winters or bad harvests. Historians still argue whether urban women had more freedom and autonomy due to economic opportunities, or if rural women, despite their physical labor, enjoyed a different kind of autonomy rooted in their indispensable role in sustenance. In towns, you might have more legal recourse and opportunities to engage with institutions like guilds or merchant associations. You'd be exposed to more diverse ideas and people. However, urban life also presented challenges like cramped living conditions, higher rates of disease, and the constant threat of fire. In the village, while life was physically demanding and opportunities were limited, there was a deep connection to the land and a strong sense of inherited community. Your choice of where to live, if you even had one, would fundamentally shape your daily routines, your social interactions, and the economic opportunities available to you. Whether you heard the rumble of carts or the whisper of the wind through grain fields, your life was a testament to adaptation and resilience within the constraints of your environment. Within the bustling environment of medieval towns, particularly, you might find yourself part of a guild, an organized association of artisans or merchants that played a crucial role in regulating trade and ensuring quality. For women, especially those involved in skilled crafts, guilds offered both opportunities and restrictions, reflecting the evolving economic landscape. A mainstream historical fact is that while many guilds were male-dominated, numerous historical records show women actively participating, and sometimes even leading, specific craft guilds. Imagine yourself as a skilled craftswoman. Perhaps you are a weaver, a silk spinner, an embroiderer, or even a goldsmith. You would likely have learned your trade from your parents or your husband, inheriting the family business and its skills. You wouldn't just be an assistant. You would be a master of your craft, producing goods for sale. If your craft was organized into a guild, you would navigate its rules and benefits. Guilds set standards for quality, controlled prices, regulated apprenticeships, and provided social support for their members. They were, in essence, early forms of trade unions and professional associations. A quirky tidbit is that some guilds, particularly those in textile production, like the silk weavers of Paris or London, were almost exclusively composed of women. In these cases, you, as a female artisan, would hold full membership, sometimes even being elected to leadership positions within the guild. This gave you a remarkable degree of autonomy and economic power, allowing you to train apprentices, manage your own workshops, and directly engage in commerce. Historians still argue whether these women-only guilds emerged from a desire for female solidarity or simply filled a niche market that men deemed less profitable. However, in many other guilds, women's roles were more circumscribed. You might be allowed to participate in your husband's guild as a free sister or wife of a master, meaning you could work in his shop and continue the business if he died. But you might not have full voting rights or be able to become a master. In your own right, apprenticeships for girls were less common than for boys, limiting pathways to independent mastery in some trades. Despite this, the economic necessity often overrode formal restrictions. If you were capable and your work was of high quality, you would find a market for your goods. You would participate in guild festivals, contribute to charitable funds for sick or elderly members, and adhere to the strict quality controls that were the hallmark of guild production. Your reputation as a craftswoman would be paramount, ensuring customers returned and your goods fetched a fair price. The tools of your trade would be an extension of your hands, the worry of the spinning wheel, the rhythmic clatter of the loom, the precise movements of a needle creating intricate patterns. Your involvement in guilds highlights a crucial aspect of medieval women's lives, their active and often vital role in the urban economy. While not always recognized with equal status to their male counterparts, women were indispensable artisans, entrepreneurs, and laborers, providing essential goods and services that kept medieval towns thriving. Your skilled hands and business acumen were not just personal assets, they were a foundational part of the economic fabric of your community. For you, a medieval woman, life was generally structured around the institution of marriage. However, not every woman was married, and the experience of being single or a widow presented a unique set of challenges, freedoms, and societal perceptions. While marriage was the expected path, remaining unmarried or becoming widowed could paradoxically offer a degree of autonomy rarely found within matrimony. A mainstream historical fact is that widows often held significantly more legal and economic independence than married women, making their status distinct and sometimes even desirable. Imagine yourself as a single woman, perhaps a spinster, a term that literally refers to a woman who spins thread, a common and essential occupation for unmarried women. If you chose not to marry, or if circumstances prevented it, your life would be different. You might live with your family, contributing your labor to their household and farm, or in a town, you might support yourself through a craft, perhaps spinning, weaving, or brewing. Your economic independence would be hard-won, but it was yours. You had no husband to legally control your property or earnings, as we discussed with This gave you freedom, but also a certain vulnerability, as you lacked the male protector that society valued. A quirky tidbit: some women chose to remain unmarried to pursue a religious life, entering a convent or becoming a beguine, allowing them to dedicate themselves to spiritual or charitable work outside the confines of domesticity. Now, consider the life of a widow. This was perhaps the most empowering legal status a medieval woman could attain. Upon your husband's death, you were legally freed from coverture. You regained your independent legal identity, able to own and manage property, enter contracts, and even conduct your own business. The dower, a portion of your husband's estate set aside for your maintenance, was legally yours to control for the rest of your life. This often gave you a significant income and assets, making you a woman of means and influence. Historians still argue whether the relative empowerment of widows truly compensated for the grief of loss and the challenges of single parenthood in a harsh world. You might choose to remain a widow, enjoying your newfound autonomy. Many widows, particularly those from merchant or noble families, successfully managed large estates, ran complex businesses, or even acted as regents for their underage sons, demonstrating formidable administrative and financial acumen. You would be responsible for the upbringing and education of your children, often arranging their marriages and securing their inheritances. Your advice might be sought by your former husband's family or by others in the community due to your experience and maturity. However, being a widow was not without its difficulties. You might face pressure to remarry, especially if you were young and wealthy, as your land or assets could be tempting to ambitious men. If you had young children, raising them alone was a significant burden, and for peasant widows, while they regained legal independence, their dower might be meager, meaning continued hard labor was necessary to survive. Ultimately, whether single or widowed, your path diverged from the societal norm, often demanding greater self-reliance and resilience. While the ideal medieval woman was a wife and mother, those who lived outside this norm carved out lives that, in their unique ways, showcased remarkable strength, economic independence, and a quiet determination to forge their own destinies, in a world that often sought to define them by their marital status. While often relegated to the background in grand narratives, medieval women made significant, albeit sometimes overlooked, contributions to the arts. Your creativity, whether expressed in intricate needlework or the written word, found outlets within the constraints of your societal roles. A mainstream historical fact is that women were highly skilled in various forms of textile arts, which were considered both practical necessities and expressions of artistic talent. Imagine yourself in a quiet chamber, perhaps the solar of a castle, or the scriptorium of a convent. Your hands are busy with needle and thread, creating an exquisite tapestry. This isn't just a simple blanket. It's a massive, woven artwork depicting historical battles, biblical scenes, or mythological figures. You might spend months, even years, on such a piece, working with wool, silk, and gold thread, meticulously crafting each stitch. This artistry, often a communal effort among women, not only provided decorative warmth for cold stone walls, but also served as a narrative, a visual record, and a testament to your family's wealth and prestige. A quirky tidbit: the famous Bayeux tapestry, depicting the Norman conquest, was likely designed and possibly even embroidered by women, demonstrating their pivotal role in monumental artistic endeavors, even if they aren't always credited by name in historical records. Beyond textiles, some women found expression in literature and scholarship. If you were a noblewoman with access to education, or a nun in a learned convent, you might engage in reading, writing, and even the copying of manuscripts. This wasn't merely a passive activity, it was an active intellectual pursuit. Figures like Christine de Pizan, a groundbreaking writer in the late Middle Ages, not only wrote poetry and prose, but also offered strong defenses of women against misogynistic stereotypes. You might have owned illuminated manuscripts, devotional books, or even secular romances, reading them aloud to other women, or savoring their stories in private moments. Historians still argue whether women's artistic contributions were primarily seen as domestic crafts rather than fine art, thereby diminishing their perceived cultural significance. However, the skill and creativity involved were undeniable. In convents, particularly, you might have been involved in the creation of illuminated manuscripts, meticulously decorating pages with intricate designs, vibrant colors, and delicate gold leaf. This work required immense patience, precision, and artistic vision. Music was another realm where women participated. You might play a lute, a harp, or sing devotional songs within the confines of your home or convent. While professional female musicians were less common outside of specific contexts like court entertainment, music was an integral part of daily life and religious practice, and women were often its quiet creators and performers. You would have learned traditional songs, lullabies for your children, and hymns for worship. Your artistic output, whether celebrated in grand halls or cherished within the privacy of your home, was a testament to the enduring human need for beauty and expression. From the practical artistry of spinning and weaving to the intellectual artistry of the written word, medieval women used their hands and minds to shape the cultural landscape, leaving behind a legacy of creativity that whispers through the centuries, even if their names are often lost to time. For you, a medieval woman, the concept of travel and pilgrimage was vastly different from modern tourism. Journeys were arduous, perilous, and typically undertaken only for significant reasons: a pilgrimage for religious devotion, a marriage, journey to a new lord's estate, or perhaps fleeing from conflict. These rare excursions offered unique experiences and dangers, far removed from the comforts of modern transit. A mainstream historical fact is that pilgrimage was one of the most common reasons for people, including women, to travel long distances. In the Middle Ages, offering both spiritual merit and a rare opportunity to see the world. Imagine preparing for a journey. There are no cars, trains, or planes, only your feet, a horse or mule if you are wealthy, or perhaps a slow, lumbering cart. Roads are often unpaved, muddy in the rain, dusty in the dry season, and frequently infested with bandits. You would pack essential provisions, hardtack bread, dried meat, perhaps a flask of ale or wine, and warm, durable clothing. Your journey might take weeks or months, each day a test of endurance. You would sleep in inns that might be little more than smoky common rooms, or in the open air, wrapped in a blanket, under the vast, star-filled medieval sky. A quirky tidbit, some medieval pilgrim guides, or itineraries, included specific warnings for women about places known for danger or where they might be exploited, highlighting the particular vulnerabilities female travelers faced. If your journey was a pilgrimage, you would be traveling to a holy site, perhaps the shrine of a local saint, a venerated relic in a distant cathedral, or even as far as Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem. The motivation would be deeply spiritual, seeking a cure for an illness, atonement for sins, or simply profound devotion. You would walk with other pilgrims, often forming small groups for safety and companionship, sharing stories and hymns along the way. The physical hardship was part of the penance, believed to purify the soul. Along the route, you would encounter fellow travelers from different social classes and regions, exchanging tales and perhaps even learning new customs or languages. Historians still argue whether pilgrimage truly offered women more social freedom than their daily lives, or if the dangers and discomforts simply masked a different kind of societal control. Regardless, for many, the journey itself was transformative. You might visit bustling market towns, quiet monasteries, and vast landscapes you'd only heard whispered about. You would meet people who held different beliefs or spoke different dialects. This exposure to a wider world could broaden your perspective in ways that a lifetime in your village never could. However, travel for women also came with significant risks. You were more vulnerable to robbery, assault, and exploitation. Without a male protector, you might be an easier target. Your reputation could be questioned if you traveled alone or without clear purpose. For noblewomen, travel might be part of a marriage arrangement, journeying to your new husband's distant lands, often with a large entourage for safety and status. This was not a leisure trip, but a strategic relocation, fraught with its own anxieties. Ultimately, travel in the Middle Ages was not for the faint of heart. For women, it was a profound act of courage and determination, driven by necessity or deep faith. It was a chance to step outside the familiar, to experience the vastness of your world, and to perhaps find a different kind of freedom on the open road, even if that freedom came hand in hand with peril. Amidst the relentless demands of survival and societal expectations, you, a medieval woman, did find moments for social gatherings and leisure, however limited or structured they might be. These brief respites offered opportunities for community, enjoyment, and a temporary escape from daily drudgery. Your leisure time, like much else, was shaped by your social class and the rhythms of your life. A mainstream historical fact is that communal feasting, dancing, and storytelling were common forms of entertainment across all social strata during the Middle Ages. Imagine a village feast day. Perhaps it's a harvest festival, a saint's day, or a wedding. You would gather with your neighbors in the communal hall or outdoors, sharing food, ale, and laughter. These events were vital for community cohesion, offering a rare chance to relax collectively. You might participate in folk dances, simple yet energetic, to the tune of a pipe or a drum. Stories would be told, often ancient tales of heroes and villains, or local gossip exchanged. Children would play simple games, perhaps chasing each other or rolling hoops. For you, these moments of shared festivity would break the monotony of hard labor, renewing spirits and strengthening bonds. A quirky tidbit: some medieval games involved rather physical and sometimes bawdy activities, like blind man's buff with much pushing and shoving, or communal singing games that allowed for playful flirting, even under watchful eyes. If you were a noblewoman, your leisure activities would be more refined and often centered around the castle or manor house. You might spend time in the solar, a private chamber, engaged in needlework, reading if you were literate, or listening to music played by resident minstrels or your ladies. You would participate in elaborate feasts, not just for sustenance, but as social events, where you would engage in conversation, watch jesters and acrobats, and enjoy the latest songs and poems. Hunting, particularly falconry, was a popular pastime. For noblewomen, requiring skill, patience, and a well-trained bird, you might ride out with a party, elegantly dressed, commanding your falcon to strike down prey. Historians still argue whether medieval leisure activities offered genuine escape, or simply served to reinforce social hierarchies and gender roles, even in moments of apparent relaxation. For instance, while you might enjoy the dance at a village feast, the act of preparing the food and cleaning up afterwards would still fall disproportionately on women. In noble circles, while you might enjoy a performance, your presence was also a display of your family's status and wealth. Beyond organized gatherings, individual leisure might be found in quieter pursuits. You might tend a small herb garden, finding solace in nurturing life. Perhaps you would share stories with your children by the firelight, passing down the oral traditions of your ancestors. If you had access to devotional books, moments of prayer and contemplation could be a form of personal respite. For those in convents, intellectual pursuits like studying manuscripts or composing hymns offered deep satisfaction and a form of spiritual leisure. Even in a world of constant labor, these moments of social connection, simple amusement, and quiet contemplation were vital. They provided a necessary balance, allowing you to recharge, to connect with your community, and to find fleeting joy amidst the often harsh realities of medieval life. When considering your daily life as a medieval woman, the concepts of sanitation and hygiene stand in stark contrast to modern standards. Yet they were approached with practical solutions born of necessity, not ignorance. You navigated a world where fresh running water was a luxury and disease was a constant threat, often without understanding its microscopic causes. A mainstream historical fact is that while medieval hygiene practices varied greatly by social class and location, they were often more sophisticated than popularly imagined, though still limited by technology. Imagine the reality of personal cleanliness. You wouldn't have a modern bathroom with a shower or flush toilet. Instead, washing would be a more communal or laborious affair. For most, this meant using basins of water, perhaps heated over a fire, and scrubbing with rough cloth, and lye soap, which was harsh but effective for grease and grime. You'd likely wash your face and hands more frequently, while full-body bathing might be less common, perhaps once a week or even less, depending on water availability and the season. A quirky tidbit: public bathhouses, inherited from Roman traditions, were common in many medieval towns, serving as social hubs as well as places for cleanliness. However, their popularity waned in later periods, partly due to concerns about modesty and the spread of disease, but also simply due to changes in social customs. Your clothing, as we discussed, was not washed daily. Outer garments would be brushed and aired, while undergarments like linen chemises would be changed and laundered more frequently. Laundry itself was a huge undertaking, involving boiling water, strong lye-based soaps, and vigorous scrubbing, often in a communal washhouse or by a river. The sheer effort involved meant it was not a casual chore. Waste disposal was a major challenge, particularly in crowded urban areas. For human waste, you might use a communal privy, a simple hole in the ground, or a chamber pot, which would then be emptied into a cesspit or, unfortunately, directly into the street or a nearby river. This, combined with animal waste and general refuse, made medieval towns notoriously smelly and unsanitary environments, breeding grounds for rats and disease vectors. Castles often had garderobes, essentially latrines built into the walls, with chutes that emptied directly into the moat or a cesspit below. Historians still argue whether the decline in public bathing in later medieval periods was due to new moral sensibilities or genuinely linked to the spread of diseases like the Black Death, though the latter is less likely given the limited understanding of germ theory. You would constantly contend with fleas, lice, and other parasites. Keeping your hair free of lice was an ongoing battle, often involving fine-toothed combs and herbal rinses. Bad breath was common, given the lack of dental hygiene, and body odor was simply a part of life. Despite these challenges, people did attempt to maintain cleanliness within their means. You'd use scented herbs to freshen clothing, carry small scented balls to ward off unpleasant odors, and understand the importance of airing out sleeping quarters. Your hygiene practices were pragmatic, adapted to the resources and knowledge of your time. They weren't about sterile environments, but about managing the inescapable realities of dirt and decay in a world without modern plumbing or sanitation systems. Your resilience extended even to enduring constant, low-level discomfort and health risks that modern societies have largely eradicated. Navigating the world of crime and punishment as a medieval woman was a perilous endeavor, where justice was often swift, brutal, and profoundly shaped by gender, social status, and local custom. Your legal vulnerability and societal expectations meant that you might face different charges or different forms of punishment than a man for similar offenses. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval justice systems, while varied, often prioritized public order and retribution over rehabilitation, with punishments frequently being public spectacles designed to deter others. Imagine a situation where you are accused of a crime. If you were a peasant, accused of something like petty theft, perhaps stealing food during a lean year, or a minor assault, you might face the village court. Punishment could range from a public shaming, like being put in the stocks or pillory, to a fine, or even a public whipping. Your local community would be your jury and your judge, and your reputation, and that of your family, would be deeply affected. A quirky tidbit: one of the specific crimes disproportionately associated with women, particularly older women, was scolding or common brawling, a perceived disruption of public peace through incessant nagging or verbal abuse, sometimes leading to the aforementioned and rather infamous ducking stool or brank. If the accusation was more serious, like murder or witchcraft, the stakes escalated dramatically. You might be subjected to an ordeal, a trial by divine judgment, such as holding a hot iron or plunging your arm into boiling water. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were deemed innocent, if not guilty. This was terrifyingly arbitrary. If found guilty of a capital crime, you faced execution, which could be by hanging, burning, particularly for heresy or witchcraft, or drowning, depending on the region and the specific offense. These punishments were often carried out publicly, meant as stark warnings to the populace. Historians still argue whether the legal system genuinely aimed for justice or primarily served to maintain the existing social hierarchy and control dissent, especially among the lower classes. Your gender could influence your sentence. For instance, in some areas, women found guilty of treason might be burned at the stake rather than drawn and quartered, as burning was considered a cleaner death. That preserved modesty, a macabre concern in such a brutal system. For crimes like adultery, the penalties could be severe for you, while your male counterpart might face little to no consequence, reflecting the double standards inherent in medieval society. For noblewomen, the legal process might involve trial by combat, though typically by a champion fighting on their behalf, or by a court of peers. Punishments, too, might differ. Perhaps imprisonment in a tower rather than public execution. Though truly high-ranking women could certainly face the full, brutal force of the law if they committed treason or other major offenses against the crown. Even if you were not the perpetrator, you might be a witness or a victim. The legal system for prosecuting rape or sexual assault was notoriously difficult for women, often requiring multiple witnesses or public outcry, and rarely resulting in convictions for the perpetrators. Your legal recourse was limited, and the concept of justice often felt distant and arbitrary. Despite this, women did bring lawsuits, did testify, and did, on occasion, find redress, showcasing their resilience in navigating a system that was largely designed by and for men. In a society often rigid in its structures and expectations, medieval women were not entirely passive figures. You found subtle, and sometimes overt, ways to exercise protest and resistance against the limitations placed upon you, pushing back against patriarchal norms, economic exploitation, or social injustices. This wasn't always a dramatic revolution. More often, it was a quiet, persistent assertion of agency. A mainstream historical fact is that while large-scale female rebellions were rare, individual acts of defiance and collective informal resistance were not uncommon. Imagine you are a peasant woman, facing an unjust levy from your lord or oppressive. Working conditions. Open rebellion would be suicidal, but you might engage in forms of passive resistance. Perhaps you work slower, feign illness, or subtly misplace tools. You might engage in gossip and rumor-mongering to undermine authority, or spread news of grievances among your peers. There were instances of women participating in local peasant revolts, even if not leading them, bringing their collective power to bear during moments of widespread discontent. You might refuse to pay a tax, or join others in collectively challenging a new, unfair custom imposed by the local lord. A quirky tidbit. Some women resorted to scolding or public verbal abuse, not just for trivial matters, but as a form of social protest against unfair practices or the perceived misbehavior of figures in authority, using their voices to shame and criticize. If you were a woman in a town, perhaps a skilled craftswoman or merchant, your resistance might take an economic form. You might subtly undercut prices, bypass unfair market regulations, or secretly trade goods outside the official channels. If your guild imposed unfair rules on women, you might petition for changes or find ways around the restrictions to ensure your business thrived. Historians still argue whether the quiet persistence of women in male-dominated trades was a form of everyday resistance against occupational segregation or simply a pragmatic response to economic necessity. For noblewomen, resistance could be far more strategic and less outwardly rebellious. If your family arranged a marriage you found utterly abhorrent, you might subtly undermine the negotiations, or even attempt to flee to a convent to take vows, thus making yourself unavailable for a secular marriage. Some high-born women, facing tyrannical husbands, sought refuge in church courts for annulments or separation, leveraging the church's authority against their spouses. Queens and noble ladies, though technically subservient, often acted as powerful political agents, using their networks, intelligence, and even emotional appeals to influence policy, protect their children's inheritance, or advocate for their favored causes. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who famously challenged her husband, King Louis VII of France. Even within the domestic sphere, resistance could manifest. You might subtly defy your husband's wishes, exert influence over household decisions, or protect your children from a harsh father. Humor and gentle sarcasm could also be tools of resistance, a way to lighten burdens and subtly critique authority without open confrontation. These acts of resistance, whether small or grand, formal or informal, illustrate that medieval women were not simply victims of their circumstances. They were active agents, often using the limited tools at their disposal to assert their will, protect their interests, and challenge the boundaries of their prescribed roles, ensuring their voices, however muted, were still heard in the grand symphony of medieval life. While direct power was often denied to them, medieval women frequently exerted considerable influence behind the scenes, leveraging their connections, social networks, and strategic acumen to shape events and outcomes. Your impact was often felt through persuasion, familial ties, and the quiet manipulation of resources rather than overt authority. A mainstream historical fact is that noblewomen, in particular, often acted as crucial intermediaries and negotiators in political and familial disputes, demonstrating significant diplomatic skill. Imagine yourself as a noblewoman, perhaps a queen, a duchess, or the wife of a powerful lord. Your husband might be away at war or at court, leaving you as the effective manager of his estates and, by extension, a key political figure in your own right. You would correspond with other noble families, perhaps arranging marriages for your children that secured vital alliances, or negotiating treaties on your husband's behalf. Your letters would be filled not just with pleasantries, but with careful diplomatic language, subtle hints, and strategic suggestions. Your intelligence network, gathered through servants, merchants, and even other noblewomen, would be invaluable, providing you with crucial information that your husband, far away, might lack. A quirky tidbit: some noblewomen maintained extensive charity networks, ostensibly for religious devotion, but which also served as powerful channels for information gathering and influencing local populations, effectively creating their own spheres of influence. Your influence extended deeply into the household, which in the Middle Ages was not just a domestic unit but also an economic and political center. You controlled the coffers, managed vast numbers of servants, and ensured the smooth functioning of the entire operation. This gave you immense practical power over resources and personnel. You might decide who received patronage, who gained employment, or who was favored with a gift, all subtle ways to build loyalty and exert control. Historians still argue whether the influence of medieval women, particularly queens, was genuinely their own or merely derived from their male relatives, and if the historical record often downplays their true agency. Beyond the nobility, women in merchant families often wielded significant economic influence. As we discussed, you might effectively run the family business, making purchasing decisions, managing sales, and interacting with clients. Your reputation for fairness and shrewdness could be as important as your husband's in ensuring the success of the enterprise. In villages, older women, particularly those with knowledge of healing or midwifery, held considerable informal power and respect. Your wisdom would be sought, your advice heeded, and your opinions given weight in community decisions. You might be the informal arbiter of disputes or the trusted confidant for numerous villagers. Even in religious institutions, women could exert influence. As an abbess, you would govern a large monastic community, manage extensive landholdings, and often negotiate with powerful bishops and secular lords. Your spiritual authority could be immense, attracting pilgrims and patrons to your abbey, and your advice might be sought by both men and women of high standing. Your influence might not always be recorded in official documents, but it would be felt in the daily lives of those around you, a quiet, persistent force shaping the course of events. From the Queen's Council to the village hearth, women skillfully navigated their limited formal roles to carve out spheres of genuine, if often unacknowledged, power and influence. In the Middle Ages, your world was imbued with spiritual beliefs, but also with a pervasive sense of the uncanny, the unknown, and the often terrifying power of witches and superstitions. These beliefs shaped daily life, influenced social interactions, and for women could tragically lead to accusations and persecution. A mainstream historical fact is that while witch hunts intensified later in the early modern period, beliefs in magic and witchcraft were present throughout the Middle Ages, often intertwined with folk medicine and pagan survivals. Imagine a sudden illness striking your child, or your crops failing inexplicably. In a world without scientific understanding of disease or agricultural blight, it was easy to seek supernatural explanations. If an old woman in the village, perhaps known for her herbal remedies and eccentric ways, had recently argued with your family, suspicion might fall upon her. You would live with a subtle, simmering fear of those who might wield malevolent magic. This fear was often directed at women, particularly those who were poor, old, unmarried, or otherwise marginalized, as they were seen as more susceptible to the devil's influence or more likely to harbor resentment. A quirky tidbit: medieval superstitions extended to everyday objects. You might carry a small stone with a natural hole in it, believing it could ward off evil spirits, or tie a knot in your clothing to bring good luck. You would participate in various protective rituals against witchcraft. This might involve blessing your home, hanging specific herbs over your doorway, or reciting charms and prayers taught by your mother or grandmother. These practices were often a blend of Christian piety and older, pagan folk beliefs that had never fully died out, reflecting a desperate attempt to control an unpredictable world. Historians still argue whether the accusations of witchcraft genuinely reflected a fear of magic or were often a convenient way to explain misfortune, suppress dissenting women, or settle personal vendettas within communities. The Church's stance on witchcraft was complex and evolved over time. While some theologians initially dismissed magic as folly, the belief in the devil and his earthly agents grew stronger, especially in the later Middle Ages. If you were accused of witchcraft, your fate could be grim. Interrogations could be brutal, and confessions, often coerced, would lead to severe punishments, including imprisonment, public shaming, or even execution, particularly by burning, seen as a purification of the heretical soul. You might be ostracized by your community, losing friends and family. simply on the basis of suspicion or rumor. Beyond the fear of witches, everyday life was saturated with smaller superstitions. You might avoid walking under ladders, cross your fingers for good luck, or carefully interpret dreams for omens. The phases of the moon influenced planting and harvesting. Certain days of the week were deemed unlucky for travel or starting new ventures. If you were a midwife, you might perform specific rituals during childbirth to protect the mother and child from evil influences. These beliefs, though seemingly irrational to modern minds, provided a framework for understanding and attempting to control an unpredictable and often frightening world. Your life, therefore, was a constant navigation between piety, practical concerns, and the ever-present shadow of the unseen forces believed to influence human destiny. While the medieval world might seem insular, you, as a medieval woman, could encounter foreigners and outsiders, experiences that would challenge your perceptions and present unique challenges, whether they were visiting merchants, distant relatives from another land, or members of minority groups within your own society. Their presence often brought both curiosity and suspicion. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the relative immobility of the majority, medieval Europe was far more interconnected than often assumed, with trade routes and pilgrimages bringing diverse peoples into contact. Imagine a merchant caravan arriving in your town, bringing goods from distant lands. You might see traders with different clothing, speaking unfamiliar languages, and perhaps even practicing a different faith. As a woman involved in trade, you might interact with them directly, haggling over prices for exotic spices, fine silks, or intricate metalwork. This exposure would broaden your world, offering glimpses into cultures vastly different from your own. You might hear tales of their homelands, of strange customs and faraway cities, sparking your imagination. A quirky tidbit in some port cities: women ran lodging houses catering specifically to foreign merchants or sailors. Becoming adept at managing diverse clientele and perhaps even learning snippets of various languages to facilitate trade and communication. However, being an outsider yourself, or encountering one, also brought suspicion. If you were a woman from a different region, marrying into a new community, you might initially be viewed with distrust. Your accent, your customs, or even your unfamiliar family name could make you an outsider for years, requiring considerable effort to integrate and gain acceptance. This was particularly true for women who moved across linguistic or cultural borders due to arranged marriages. Historians still argue whether medieval communities were more tolerant or xenophobic towards outsiders, noting that both hospitality and hostility were common responses depending on circumstances and individual prejudices. For you, encountering Jewish women in a medieval town, for instance, would be a specific experience. Jewish communities, though often segregated, were an integral part of many urban centers, contributing to trade and finance. You might interact with them in the marketplace, but religious differences often led to social tension and periods of persecution, making their lives and any interaction with them fraught with underlying anxieties. Muslim women, though rare in most of Christian Europe, would be encountered in Spain or Sicily, or perhaps as captives or visitors from the Crusader states, bringing with them a vastly different cultural and religious framework. You might also encounter women who were considered outsiders within Christian society itself, such as those accused of heresy. While the Church persecuted heretics, everyday interactions could still occur, creating a complex social dynamic. Your response to these encounters would be shaped by your personal experiences, your religious education, and the prevailing attitudes of your community. Would you be curious and open, or suspicious and fearful? Your life, like that of any medieval person, was lived within a framework of shared beliefs and fears, but also with the occasional, jarring exposure to the wider world and its diverse inhabitants. These encounters, however brief, offered a rare window into the vast tapestry of human experience beyond your immediate ken. For you, a medieval woman, your story is often fragmented, pieced together from scant evidence, making your legacy and historical record a challenge for modern understanding. Unlike powerful kings or notable male scholars, the vast majority of women left behind little direct evidence of their lives, making it difficult to fully reconstruct their experiences. A mainstream historical fact is that most medieval records were created by literate men, clerics, lawyers, chroniclers, who often focused on the activities of other powerful men, leaving the everyday lives of women largely unchronicled. Imagine trying to find traces of your own existence centuries from now. What would remain? Perhaps a few entries in a church baptism or marriage register, a fleeting mention in a Lord's court roll regarding a minor dispute, or your name on a tax record. If you were a noblewoman, there might be letters, charters bearing your seal, or even effigies on tombs. But for the vast majority of peasant women, your life would pass largely unrecorded, existing only in the memories of your family and community. Your achievements, raising children, feeding your household, tilling the land, producing textiles, were seen as part of the natural order, not remarkable enough for chroniclers to note. A quirky tidbit, one of the most compelling insights into everyday medieval life, including women's lives, often comes from unexpected sources, like wills, household inventories, and court records of minor disputes, which sometimes reveal fascinating details about possessions, relationships, and daily struggles. Historians still argue whether the relative silence of women in medieval historical records reflects their true lack of agency, or merely the bias of the record keepers who prioritized male activities and concerns. It's a complex question, as the absence of evidence does not always equate to the absence of experience. We learn about you through indirect means, through archaeological digs that unearth the tools you used, the homes you lived in, or the clothing fragments you wore. We learn through legal codes that dictated your rights, and through religious texts that prescribed your behavior. We learn through economic records that hint at your labor, and sometimes through literary works that, though fictional, can offer glimpses into societal norms and ideals. The challenge for modern historians is to read between the lines and use a multidisciplinary approach to reconstruct your world. They look for your voices in the margins of manuscripts, in the occasional court testimony, or in the records of convents. They analyze the material culture, the spindle whorls, cooking pots, and personal adornments that speak to your daily routines and aspirations. They study demographic data to understand patterns of marriage, childbirth, and lifespan, painting a statistical portrait where individual stories are rare. Your legacy, therefore, is not primarily one of famous deeds or written works, but of quiet endurance, essential labor, and the continuation of human society. You are the countless women who birthed generations, who fed communities, who kept homes running, and who passed down traditions, skills, and stories through oral culture. Your historical record is less a grand narrative and more a mosaic assembled from countless small, often mundane, pieces of evidence, each whispering a tiny part of your profound and indispensable contribution to the fabric of the Middle Ages. Your presence may be subtle in the archives, but but your impact was anything but. To truly understand your life as a medieval woman, it's helpful to consider it in contrast to the eras that came before and after, comparing different eras to highlight what was unique, what persisted, and what fundamentally changed. Your medieval existence was a bridge between the ancient world and the dawn of modernity, carrying echoes of the past while subtly laying foundations for the future. A mainstream historical fact is that the fall of the Roman Empire profoundly impacted women's legal and social status, often leading to a more localized and patriarchal society in early medieval Europe. Imagine looking back at a Roman woman's life. In ancient Rome, women, particularly those of higher status, could hold significant property, divorce relatively easily, and sometimes even wield considerable informal political influence through their husbands or families. While still patriarchal, Roman law offered some avenues for female autonomy that became less common in the early Middle Ages. For you, a woman of the early medieval period, the more localized nature of power and the strong influence of the Church often meant a reduction in those formal legal rights, with your legal identity becoming more tied to your male guardians under systems like coverture, as we discussed. A quirky tidbit, despite the perceived darkness of the early Middle Ages, archaeological evidence from some Germanic cultures shows women buried with surprisingly rich grave goods, indicating a degree of wealth and status that might challenge assumptions about their universal subjugation. Now, look forward to the early modern period, to the Renaissance and beyond. The rise of printed books, the Protestant Reformation, and the burgeoning mercantile economy would again shift the landscape for women, though not always universally for the better. The emphasis on individual piety during the Reformation, for example, encouraged literacy in women so they could read the Bible, but it also closed down convents, removing a key alternative life path and intellectual space for many. The growth of market economies might offer new entrepreneurial opportunities, but also intensified competition, sometimes pushing women out of traditionally female-dominated trades as they became more profitable. Historians still argue whether the medieval period was, in some ways, a more liberating era for certain categories of women like powerful abbesses or independent widows than the rigid social structures that emerged with later absolutist monarchies. Throughout these comparisons, certain continuities are evident. The fundamental roles of women as childbearers and caregivers remained paramount across all eras. The bulk of domestic labor, from cooking to cleaning and clothing production, largely remained the purview of women. The dangers of childbirth persisted, for centuries only significantly mitigated with modern medicine. The social and economic impact of female labor, though often undervalued, was consistently vital to the survival and prosperity of families and communities. However, the specific constraints and opportunities shifted. The legal framework, the types of work available, the influence of religious institutions, and the very concept of education all evolved. Your medieval experience was distinct in its blend of harsh agricultural realities, deeply embedded Christian faith, localized social structures, and the quiet, pervasive influence you wielded within these bounds. You were not a Roman woman, nor were you a woman of the Enlightenment. You existed in a unique historical moment, shaped by specific forces that defined your roles, your struggles, and your quiet triumphs. Understanding this difference illuminates the true contours of your medieval life. As we bring our journey through the Middle Ages to a close, reflect on your life as a medieval woman, and you'll find an enduring spirit that echoes across centuries, connecting your experiences to the vast tapestry of womanhood. Your daily struggles, your quiet joys, and your immense contributions continue to resonate, reminding us of the fundamental human experiences that transcend time. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the patriarchal structures of the Middle Ages, women consistently found ways to assert their agency and contribute indispensably to society, laying groundwork for future generations. Imagine the myriad tasks you performed each day, the calluses on your hands, the strength in your back from years of labor, the rhythmic hum of the spinning wheel, the gentle lullaby you sang to your child, the comforting warmth of the hearth you tended. These are the subtle sounds and feelings that shaped your existence. You navigated a world without modern conveniences, relying on ingenuity, community, and sheer resilience. You were a mother, a wife, a laborer, a craftswoman, a healer, and often the quiet backbone of your family and village. A quirky tidbit is how often women's collective knowledge, passed down orally through generations, formed a crucial informal knowledge network for everything from farming tips to herbal remedies, far predating formal institutions. Historians still argue whether the quiet endurance of medieval women was simply a necessity for survival, or if it harbored a deeper, often unacknowledged, strength and wisdom that helped shape the very foundations of Western civilization. You lived a life deeply connected to the natural world, to the cycles of planting and harvest, birth and death. Your fears were tangible: famine, disease, war, and the constant threat of losing a child in infancy. Yet, your resilience was equally tangible, finding solace in faith, community, and the simple pleasures of a good harvest or a peaceful evening by the fire. Your influence, often behind the scenes, was profound. You managed households, educated children, tended the sick, and often held communities together through sheer force of will and practical knowledge. Your hands wove the fabric, brewed the ale, ground the grain, and prepared the food that sustained medieval society. Your spirit, marked by adaptability and perseverance, is a testament to the human capacity to thrive, even in the most challenging environments. As the light fades, imagine your medieval self settling down after a long day. The hearth fire crackles, softly casting dancing shadows on the walls. The familiar sounds of the village begin to hush, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets outside. The worries of the day, the endless tasks, begin to recede, replaced by the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. You are tired, but there is a deep satisfaction in knowing you have contributed. You have survived, and you have, in your own way, shaped the world around you. The faint scent of wood smoke still lingers in the air, a gentle reminder of the distant past. Let the images and sounds of this bygone era slowly dissolve as you drift deeper into comfort and calm. The long journey is over, the work is done, and now it's time for rest. Let the quiet echoes of medieval life lull you into a peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams.